Thank you for joining us. I'm Deborah Tomlinson with Inside the Vatican, Urbi at Orbi Communications. We welcome you to this special edition of Inside the Vatican's Writers Chat. We have a very special guest, and Chris Deirdre, our Robert's assistant editor, will be introducing him. We were delayed in opening. Robert Moynihan is with us as well, and he and Dr. Paul Kengor were sharing their sadness. Both of they share the same editor, John Morehouse, and John Morehouse died unexpectedly last Saturday evening. So they're talking about that, and we just decided to bring you in because it's just it's been a heaviness for all of us, very heavy for Robert, and also I'm sure for Paul as well, because the editor is a big part of a book. And today we're talking about Paul's book, who John edited as well. So, Chris, yes, I turn it over to you.
John did this, Finding Vigano.
Yeah.
That's Bob's book, and he did this, The Devil and Karl Marx. And he was doing so many great books, doing such great things. And when I got the call on Sunday from Connor Gallagher at Tan Books that I had never actually talked to Connor before. We had emailed, that was it. And I saw the phone call, and I so why would he be calling me? Yeah. And it said important, give me a call. And as I started talking to him, he said, well, I've got really bad news. Our beloved colleague, and I'm thinking to myself, oh no, what's he gonna say? And then he said, John Morehouse died. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. How? Why? And I immediately thought car accident or something like that. He died of a heart attack at the age of 51, and 5 children, and died at home. And it's just sad. It's one of those why God moments, you know, and it's just it just shouldn't be. It's just a shame. And it's what's today, Friday. I'm still sick about it. In fact, the day I got the call was my birthday. So it was the day after he died was my birthday. And so I was getting ready to go in and have dinner with my wife had made a special birthday dinner and everything. And I said to Connor, I said, I can't go eat right now. I feel like throwing up. I feel sick to my stomach. Yeah. And it's just been, it's just such a loss. And he was doing great things at Tan Books. I mean, he'll be, of course, irreplaceable as a father and husband, and he's going to be probably irreplaceable too as an editor. It's just a shame. Yeah.
Well, sitting beside Bob on his project, I clearly saw the hand of the editor and how important it was, and how he really guided Bob in a kind, gentle way, and at times somewhat forceful when he had to be, but just always in charity, but kept his eye on the ball and kept things going. And he was always so calm.
Yes, a good guy, a nice person.
Yes, yeah.
Right.
And your book came out in August, correct?
It did, yeah.
So he had two of the biggest books of Tan Books is your book and Bob's book right now, and he had those back to back. So I can imagine the pressure there.
Well, and he was making a very conscious effort to bring in top talent. I mean, writers of renown and experience, and really aggressively searching out people. In fact, I could tell you, I mean, I really truly owe this book to John, because it was an idea that I've had for years and was already working on it, had set it aside, was going to do it with another publisher that went out of business. And I said, that's fine. I don't want to do this book anyway. I don't want to do it right now. And John kept after me. He said, come on. I want to do a book with you. I want to do a book with you. And then I said, well, I do have this book titled The Devil and Karl Marx. And he said, I want that book. Right. And so he started saying, I don't care what advance you want for it. Just tell me. And for the guys at Tan, that's not totally true. I wouldn't, he wouldn't have given me anything that I asked for. But I just said, oh, all right, okay, all right, let's go for it. So it was with his urging that we did it. And he went and he got the person who wrote the foreword is Michael Knowles. And Michael Knowles is a really popular Catholic podcast talk show, and just a really fascinating. In fact, younger people in particular know him. My kids know him. My students at Grove City College know him. And that was a brilliant idea. I would not have sought out Michael Knowles. In fact, when he told me, I thought, Michael Knowles. But it was perfect. He wrote a perfect foreword, and he was pursuing more people like probably Michael, like myself, like Bob, and he was bringing in really quality. He was starting, just really some really attractive books, attractive authors. It's a shame. It's a loss. It's a tragedy. Feels so bad for his wife and kids.
Yeah.
Well, I could say the same thing about this book, that John, really without John, I don't know that I could have finished it. There were pressures, there were voices coming to us from the Vatican not to publish anything about Archbishop Vigano. Not that they knew or guessed what I was going to say, but they just felt anything from their perspective would be a negative. I felt that we should clarify and explain the Archbishop's position. John agreed with that. I ended up with days and days of tape recordings, which I then transcribed, and that took most of last fall. I had said to him, John, we'll have this book done by Christmas 2019.
Wow.
And I kept working at it. And in January, I said, okay, I think I finally got a handle on everything he said, but it's going to be about 2,000 pages. And then he said, well, because he was discussing the papacy of Pope Benedict, his resignation, all these controversial questions. And he said, look, why don't we concentrate on the man, finding Vigano as a man? And then we'll come back, maybe if we can, and do a second volume. So he solved the problem, which really was tearing me apart. I was exhausted thinking, what am I going to do? I'll have to cut everything. And he said, no, we'll do two.
Good.
And then immediately after that, the virus started.
Yeah.
And then Archbishop Vigano started speaking out about the virus and the deep state. And he wrote a letter to Trump. And I said, what are we going to do about this? He said, just continue and focus on the man, and we'll come back to these things. And all through the spring and summer, we finalized the book. I knew he was always talking about you, Paul.
Yeah, was he?
He was saying you were doing a great book, and that book, actually, I think, as far as I know, it's the best-selling book Tan has ever had. And I'm trying to catch you. But John was a friend. He was steady. He was so calm. I met him. He was like a brother to me in some ways, and I didn't expect that he would pass away so soon.
Yeah. Wow.
And every day I'm thinking about him and his steadiness. Like all of you, I'm sure you've lost dear ones, and John was a dear friend.
Yeah.
Unexpected death, right in the middle of big projects. And he was a real defender. He was building Tan Books, which is famous for its classics. Wonderful. I wanted to be associated with that because of its classic reprints of wonderful Catholic literature from decades and even centuries ago. So I feel, I made that choice to go with him, but now he's gone. And Paul, you and I know how he was to work with. No one else really can know that, but he was a tremendous support to us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's well said. Well said. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. Only 51 years old. Only 51 years old.
Yeah. People are saying that that's always the Lord's message to each of us. Get your house in order.
By the way, I could imagine his reaction to you. Now I'm smiling when you told him 2,000 pages, right? And he probably said, no. It's not going to be 2,000. Not going to be 2,000 pages. But Yeah, as I was reading through your book, Bob, that struck me all the time that it must have taken just to transcribe all that you had from him, from Vigano alone. And by the way, the title "Finding Vigano" is brilliant. I mean, it's a great title, just a great title. I got to ask, was that yours or John's title?
Well, I think it was mine, and John leapt on it and agreed with it. I was wondering if it was a little too popular, but then I wanted to kind of make the book popular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and it's a great read. People are going to love it. People are going to love it.
Well, I appreciate that. I could just say, and then we'll get on to your book, Paul, but I'll just say I felt that I could protect the Archbishop by presenting him as a person, because in the ecclesiastical fisticuffs and wars between progressives and conservatives, and between people who really want to take control of the church's doctrine and pilot it towards an encounter with the modern world, for good and for bad, they despised the way that they disliked Vigano. They said he was a traitor to the Brotherhood. He had spoken out directly against Pope Francis. And I thought, how can I help the Archbishop? I said, the only possible way is to present him as a man of faith, as a person, to show his background, his life, and I can cut through this other polemic. And that was sort of the thought I had in doing the book.
Well, and this book does that. And John, a number of times when I was emailing him as I was going through the book, and I think it took me about 3 weeks to read it, because I was reading it carefully and making a lot of notes. And John kept saying, "What do you think about the interludes?" Right? Interludes is like an interesting device that you have in there. And I said, "Oh, I like them. I think the interludes are some of the best parts of the book." But you do a great job of talking about Vigano, what he believed, and then stopping and taking a step back and putting this in the context of the church's teaching. And I mean, that's all very valuable, and it will make people more sympathetic to Vigano, and they should be, because it really does indeed come across that he's an honest broker here. I mean, the criticisms that he's making he feels duty bound to do that, and in order to help the church. So he's making those criticisms not to tear down, but to help, to build up. And
Right.
And that's important. Well, this is definitely a writer's chat, is it not?
Yes, it really is. And
For me, it's even, I'm enjoying listening to the two authors exchange, but I think for everybody else, Chris, I give it to you now to introduce today's guest, Dr. Paul Kengor, so everyone can be on the same page about who this fantastic writer is that's joining us today.
Okay, thank you. So Dr. Paul Kengor is with us. He's a professor of political science at Grove City College in Pennsylvania. And he's the senior editor and chief academic fellow at the college's Institute for Faith and Freedom. He's authored several books, including A Pope and a President, John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, and the Extraordinary Untold Story of the 20th Century, and The Politically Incorrect Guide to Communism, among others. And he's written for periodicals, both Catholic and secular, on faith and the political sphere. So we're going to talk to Dr. Kengor about his newest book, which is, as we just heard, called The Devil and Karl Marx, recently released by Tan Books. So welcome, Dr. Kengor, to our writers chat, and welcome everyone who's joining us today.
Well, thank you, Chris, and good to finally meet you face to face,
Yeah.
kind of face to face. And like so many people, our relationships are always by email, right? And,
yes, well, it's better than nothing, huh?
Yeah, but thank you for that. It's great to be with you, and I admire the magazine and the work that all of you do. You guys put out a really great product.
Thanks very much. Thank you. We try. So, let me ask you about your new book, The Devil and Karl Marx. It was a fascinating read. I enjoyed every page of it. It details the genesis and progress of Marx's political theory, among other things. So I wonder if you could sort of briefly define for us Marxism and communism in layman's terms. What exactly is this system that has captured the imaginations of so many people in diverse locations and circumstances over a long time, right? We're talking 170 plus years in its various iterations. So let's start with that, please.
Yeah, it's a good question, Chris. I tell you, I don't know what the attraction is. I really don't. And I mean, I've never understood that. From the time I tell people, if you want to understand Marx, read the manifesto. I mean, I speak across the country all the time, especially to student groups, and I'll have young people say to me, well, the Communist Manifesto is a pretty good book if you just read it. And I say, yeah, really? Have you read it? And I kind of give them that look, and they say, well, I've kind of skipped around a little bit, and I just say, you haven't read it, have you? And they haven't read it. And that's because they haven't read it, because it is, as our church says, the ideas are just contrary to human nature. And you read a simple paragraph like, I have the book right there, but I won't grab it. But Marx and Engels wrote in 1848, and by the way, they originally called this their Communist Confession of Faith. And Engels even wrote to Marx, I quote this in the book, where Engels said, give a little more thought to our Communist Confession of Faith. I think we should drop the catechetical form and call it simply the manifesto, the Communist Manifesto. So there's a lot of this use of religious language in here, almost an aping or mocking of God in many cases. But when you read their Communist Confession of Faith, when you read their Communist Manifesto, you can look at lines like, the entire communist theory may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. And as we were preparing this, Chris, you saw my tech team behind me when they came in, my 13-year-old son, my 9-year-old son, and my 10-year-old daughter, okay? If I showed them, I say, what do you think about this idea, right? The entire communist theory may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. They could probably tell you that you'd have to kill 100 million people to implement that idea. I mean, the idea of abolishing private property, you're going to have a war on your hands. I mean, that is against Judeo-Christian values, everything from the cave to the courthouse. Thou shalt not steal implies that you have a right to property. And I've read I quote in the book Francis Wien, among others, who are sympathetic Marx biographers, and they say, oh, it's ridiculous to blame Marx for the Gulag, right? Lenin and Stalin did that. Ridiculous to blame Marx. I mean, you come up with an idea like abolition of private property, you're going to need guns and gulags. That's just all there is to it. But the idea of Marxism is that history would go through this series of dialectical stages, from slavery to feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. And so socialism would be this final transitionary step to full-blown communism. Marion Smith of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, he likes to say that the difference between socialism and communism is, just as Christians aspire to heaven, socialists aspire to communism. And I like that phrase because it really is like a religion. As Pope Benedict XVI said, communists aspire to this new Jerusalem without God, this strictly material world. And I quote throughout the book a number of examples of different communists who describe communism as like a religion. And Ronald Reagan said, communism, that religion of theirs. So it really is that. I mean, communism is their earthly utopia, their secular utopia. So they would abolish private property. They would abolish, I mean, so many things. Probably the only word that Marx might use more than the word abolish or abolition is the word criticism. In fact, in his Opiate of the Masses essay, he says that the criticism of religion is the beginning of all criticism. And he uses the word criticism or criticize 29 times in the Opiate of the Masses essay, where he refers to religion as the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions, the opiate of the people. And he's constantly saying, he wrote, Marx did in a letter to Arnold Rouge, his friend in 1843, called for the ruthless criticism of everything that exists. The ruthless criticism of everything that exists. If you look on pages 383 to 384 of my book, I give a bunch of different bullet points where I list a number of different things where Marx is just attacking, criticizing. Or we just a couple of exhibits. This is the Communist Manifesto. This is the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels said, communism seeks to abolish the present state of things. All right. I mean, no small deal there, right? We just want to abolish the present state of things, right? I mean, imagine one of my students turned in a term paper, right? Professor Kengor, I am proposing in here to abolish the present state of things, right? Okay, F, right? Communism represents the most radical rupture in traditional relations. Yes. The close of the manifesto. Everybody remembers the line, workers of the world unite, throw off your chains, we have a world to win. This too is in the closing paragraph. The communists openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Their ends can only be attained, said Marx and Engels, by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. They don't even say something like, our ends can be attained only by making some crucial changes in some really important social conditions. No, the forcible overthrow of all existing. So, I mean, you talk about a couple of madmen who wanted to burn down the house. I mean, nothing was to be left standing. Communists everywhere support, close of the manifesto, every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. And one more. Marx had a favorite quote from Goethe's spouse, the Mephistopheles character, who was the devil or demon character. And that quote was, everything that exists deserves to perish. So Chris, if someone was to ask you, me, Bob, if someone was to say, hey, give us a favorite quote, right? Say, oh, okay, well, this proverb, right? Or maybe this verse from the New Testament, or this quote from St. Francis, or, I got it, be not afraid, right? Marx said, oh, that's easy, right? Everything that exists deserves to perish. So, wow, scripture, Marx, where did you get that? No. Mephistopheles, Goethe's spouse, demon, devil character. And people said they could hear Marx not just reciting that, but chanting that. And so that, I would tell people, is Marxism. And yet, if you ask people today, young people who say that they support communism, why do you support communism? Well, because communism calls for helping your fellow man and for sharing, right? And which shows you one good thing. They don't understand Marxism. They have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. So if there is a ray of hope in this, it's that if we could simply teach them what Marx believes and what the manifesto actually says, I don't think many of them are going to be communists, because this is an idea that should not be attractive to anybody. And the only allure that I could possibly think of, or maybe not even allure is the right word, the only explanation I could maybe think of as to why this ever picked up any currency at all, I think it's a spiritual explanation. I think you got to look to darker forces diabolical forces to understand this attraction. And it's been a seductive, fatal attraction, because everywhere that it's been tried, it's led to death and destruction. And that's not a surprise when you actually read Marx and read about Marxism and the Communist Manifesto. It's not just Lenin, it's not just Stalin, it's not just Mao, it's not just Pol Pot, it's not just Castro, it's Marx. This is a horrible ideology, and our church has understood that in encyclicals going back to at least Qui Pluribus in 1846. Sorry, that's a long answer to probably several of your questions.
It does touch on several questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll pick up where you just left off with the church condemning Marxism. Real briefly, what are the specific concrete things the church has said about it? I mean, apart from the destruction that Marx talks about of the social order, which obviously would include religion and churches.
Right.
What else is it at its core that the church finds odious about Marxism, and in what she said in her condemnations, and is she saying anything now?
Yeah, maybe here I'll quote my Jewish friend Dennis Prager, and he said that when after he read this book, and he already knew this because he studied Marxism for a long time, but he said this is just pure nihilism. I mean, that's really what Marxism is. I mean, it is indeed the ruthless criticism of everything that exists. It's just simply about tearing down the entirety of the order, biblical, religious, natural law. As Marx and Engels say in the Communist Manifesto, all morality, all religion. The church even understood how Marxism attacked the family. And there's a line in the Communist Manifesto that says this, quote, "Abolition of the family, exclamation mark, even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists." So Marx and Engels in 1848 could already refer to abolition of the family as an infamous proposal of the communists. So people knew about this. They knew what was going on. By the way, this is why people like Marx were under police surveillance by Prussian police spies, because normal people understood in the mid 1800s just how destructive and insane this ideology was. I mean, this was obvious to people. It was just obvious to people. And only in a world like we are today, to quote Benedict XVI, the dictatorship of relativism, where everything is questioned and everything is redefined, from unborn human life to one's gender to marriage to, I mean, speaking of gender, Facebook 5 years ago listed over 70 different gender options. The BBC did a documentary a year or two ago that listed over 100 different gender options. For woke Christians who are listening to us, who would think you're being understanding and showing empathy for a guy who wants to be a girl, or a girl who wants to identify as a guy, no, that's not enough. That's only like 4 gender options. I mean, there's over 100, man. You're way behind. That's why the phrase LGBTQIA+ has been invented, because you need a plus for the ... for for the many gender options that you literally can't conceive of. How many options are there? As many as people want to invent. So so that's the relativistic world that we're in.
Right.
And to bring it back to Marx, this is interesting. People don't realize this, Chris, but in the Opiate of the Masses essay by Marx, he actually commends Martin Luther, and he appreciates Luther. And a writer for National Review criticized me for pointing this out. And I say very carefully in that section that I'm not blaming Luther for communism, okay? But Marx there commends Luther for a crucial breakaway from the authority of the church, because by allowing for that breakaway from the authority of the church, it begins to allow people to, each and every individual, to become his or her own authority, including on matters of scripture and truth and morality. And so, you know, once that is broken, once that's open up, it allows for this kind of religious relativism and moral relativism where we are today, this dictatorship of relativism. And the church over time, increasingly more and more and more over the years, church theologians have understood this. Here in America, Fulton Sheen was so brilliant in foreseeing all of this. I quote Sheen a lot. And of course, he wasn't alone. I'll stop there, sorry.
So, yeah, sure. So talking about woke Christians, I'm sure you're aware that a few months ago in the Jesuit magazine America, there was an article called "The Case for Communism." What was that about? And is there, I mean, just being the devil's advocate, is there some glimmer of truth in communism? That the author, I didn't read the article, but if what was their case, and what do you say about it?
It's one of the worst articles I've ever read. and I mean, honestly, it was July 2019. It's called "The Catholic Case for Communism." I was on vacation at the Jersey Shore. I got a text from Tom, one of the producers of Relevant Radio, and he said, "You're not going to believe this." And he said, "Can you come on the show?" This was Drew Mariani's show on Relevant Radio. I said, "Oh, Tom, I don't want to read this. You know, I just don't even want to read it." And so I sat down and I read it, and then I texted him back. I said, "All right, I'll come on right away." And in fact, I remember driving around there by the Jersey Shore, and I lost reception while I was doing the show. But it is, it's the kind of article that, you know, American Magazine, and the editor even published a piece called "Why We Published an Article Called The Catholic Case for Communism." This would have, I'm not exaggerating here, Chris, and I don't mean this in a mean way. That article would have gotten them excommunicated in 1949 under Pope Pius XII's papal decree against communism. I published that decree in this book. It would have gotten them excommunicated. It was so utterly and completely contrary to church teaching. And I read the article, and there's nothing new there whatsoever. And that's what's even more sad. And I know the name of the author. I won't say it here, but it was just shocking. And in fact, if any of them, if you're listening right now, check out in my book the letter that I published from Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker. It's not a letter. It's an opening editorial where it rejects Earl Browder and Communist Party USA's outstretched hand to Catholics. And that letter by, right, the very liberal, right, Dorothy Day and her Catholic Worker is so beautiful and powerful and elegant, eloquent in telling Catholics and telling Earl Browder why Catholics cannot be communists, right? Even if we might agree with you on certain things like workers' rights, helping the poor, and so forth, these things are incompatible. You know, Catholicism and communism are incompatible. And Pope Pius XI and Quadragesimo Milano, no one at the same time can call himself a socialist and a Catholic, let alone a communist and a Catholic. And in fact, that article, if that article was read today by Pius XI, Fulton Sheen, Dorothy Day, the Catholic Worker, and not only would they have all been horrified, Marx and Engels and Lenin and Stalin and Bukharin would have been horrified. I mean, like Bukharin said, communism and religion are incompatible. We must fight religion at the tip of the bayonet. Lenin said, all worship of a divinity is a necrophilia. He said, quote, there is nothing more abominable than religion, unquote. Marx not only called religion the opiate of the masses, the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of heartless conditions, the soul of a soulless world. Marx said, communism begins where atheism begins. So you can't write an article called The Catholic Case for Communism because there isn't a Catholic case for communism. You might as well follow that up with The Catholic Case for Atheism and then do part 3, the Catholic case for Satanism. I mean, that's just ridiculous, and it shows where we are in the world today, that Catholics don't even know this, and that an article like that can be published. It's just, and I'm sorry I'm angry, but when I read things like that, I think, why am I even bothering? Why do I even bother writing the things that I write? Why? It's just this, my sense of frustration at something like that is just immense. Anyway, cheers.
Understandably.
Yeah.
So
water, I need a drink. Gianna, bring me some wine. Jack Daniels.
After bringing that up.
Yeah.
So one part of the book I found truly fascinating, and it was a little bit sensational, but not that you were, put it in there to be sensational. The spiritual and spiritualist, I guess you'd call it, background and experience of Marx and Engels, and which really brought home that he was not just kind of a confused soul, but he had really chosen, like I copied down a couple lines from the poem that you cite. He said, "Thus heaven I forfeited, I know it full well, my soul once true to God is chosen for hell." So he had himself a definitive sense that this was a spiritual endeavor, and he was on the side of evil, I guess you'd have to say. Can you talk some more about that?
Yeah, and that passage from a poem in 1837, I like that one in the sense that I think it's quite autobiographical. So my soul once true to God, which was indeed the case with him. He had been baptized a Christian in 1824, probably when he was about 5 years old, maybe 5 or 6 years old. So his soul had once been true to God. And I wouldn't say that his soul was chosen for hell, right? As Catholics, I don't think we would say that. But he came to reject that. And I quote after that a poem from 1841 where he says, "See this sword, this blood dark sword, which stabs unerringly within thy soul. This sword, who sold it to me? The Prince of Darkness sold it to me." And his plays and poems are filled with that kind of darkness, with suicide pacts, pale maidens taking suicide, taking poison and killing themselves. By the way, name for me another figure in all of history who had 2 daughters who killed themselves with poison in suicide pacts with their husbands, and that was Karl Marx. And one of Marx's sons-in-law, in fact, one of them backed out on the suicide pact after giving Marx's daughter the poison, and she died. The other son-in-law, he was very low self-esteem. He was partly Cuban, which in Marx's view meant he was partly Negro. In fact, I quote, he and Engels, their evolutionary racism, trying to deduce with scientific accuracy how much Negro blood Paul had. And Marx referred to Paul as the gorilla or Negrillo. And they were always comparing him to like apes, monkeys, and so forth. This is another thing that one of my kids was just telling me about a professor at the college who's a Marxist and of course a leftist. I said, just tell the professor that Marx was a racist, right? Why are they allowed to get away with this? If Marx was a conservative and conservatives were following him, every student on campus would be chasing down the pro-Marxist professor and denouncing him as a racist, right? It's bad to have a Confederate flag, but it's not bad to support Marx, right? I mean, Marx was a racist. Marx was an absolute racist. But his poems are filled with that kind of junk, suicide pacts. It's hard to know, when he's putting himself in the poem, when it's autobiographical, when it reflects himself or a character that he's developing. But in many cases, it does seem to reflect where he's personally coming from. And for the record, I'm very careful about this in the book. 3 or 4 times I'm repetitive in saying, I can't say that I have evidence of Marx engaging in black masses or seances, although I do quote in the book places like the Patesti prison, where they were tying Christians to crosses, they were doing black masses, they were taking Christians, the communists were, and forcing them to consecrate human feces, excrement, and turn it into communion wafers and feed it and put it in people's mouths. Horrible, horrible stuff. Referring to Christ as the great idiot crucified, referring to the Blessed Mother as the great whore, every kind of satanic, vile thing that you could possibly imagine. So I document Marxists doing that. I don't have any examples of Marx himself doing anything that vile. And I quote too different biographers, including Robert Paine, very respected British man of letters, very thoughtful academic, 60s, 1970s, wrote the 2 best biographies of Marx. And he has a chapter in his 68 biography of Marx published by Simon & Schuster called The Demons. And he said that it did seem as if Marx might have been possessed by demons. He said he had the devil's malignity in view of the world. And so Paine goes that far. The late pastor Richard Wormbrand, who was tortured for Christ in Romanian prisons, he said the same thing, that he believed that Marx was a Satanist. So I quote them saying that, and then I say, I don't know if that's true or not. I certainly don't know if Marx was possessed, but I'm going to lay out what others said, what others haven't said. And overall, while we don't want to overstate this, we don't want to understate it either. And when you read all of this, I don't care if you're pro-Marxist, if you read this book, which they won't, but if you do, you'll walk away from it saying, all right, I got to admit, this is pretty ugly. This is pretty disturbing. Maybe I'm still a Marxist, but this is some pretty scary stuff. This guy was a weirdo, right? So at the very least, people should come away with that.
Right. Real quickly, you also delve into cultural Marxists of the 20th century, now 21st century, and you give us some examples of how they seem to have ties to evil spiritual forces. Can you kind of draw the link there between progressive movements like militant feminism? I know you mentioned Kate Millett in your book, and how they're related to Marxism.
Yeah, Kate Millett, who was called the Mao Zedong of the women's movement. She was on the cover of Time magazine. She wrote the book Sexual Politics, which was her dissertation at Columbia. She died in a hotel room in Paris about 2 years ago, fell over from a heart attack next to her wife. She had taken a wife she had married. And I interview at great length her sister, Mallory. Mallory believes that Kate was possessed. Mallory flat out believes that Kate was possessed. And she says it over and over and over and over again. And she's told me, she said, Paul, one of the most chilling things in my life has been to watch all the people who read my sister's books and turn my sister into a kind of a guru, when they don't realize that my sister was deeply disturbed, if not insane, and even possessed. And she said, it never ceases to amaze me. If they only knew what my sister was like, they wouldn't even read this stuff. And I've read Sexual Politics. It's a horrible book. It's impenetrable, as is Herbert Marcuse's books, Eros and Civilization, One Dimensional Man. This is a screed that's just, it's just, I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound insulting, but I say it seems insane. I mean, it seems insane. Like somebody who's not in possession of logical, rational faculties. Walter Benjamin, he was one of the Frankfurt School guys. He was into some really weird stuff. Very, very, very disturbing. He took his life. He killed himself. I also spent a lot of time on Wilhelm Reich, who literally wrote the book, The Sexual Revolution. He coined the term the sexual revolution. He was a Freudian Marxist. He was a sexual Marxist. He was trying to create a unified field, school of Marxism called Freudian Marxism. So that's when Marxism went from being based on class and economics in the 19th century into the 20th century, when people like Reich started applying it to sexuality. So did Marcuse. So did Kate Millett. They started applying it to culture. The Frankfurt School people started applying it to culture. Today, if you read some of the statements by Angela Davis, America's most famous female Marxist, she just, right here. This is the memoir of Patrisse Cullors. She's the founder of Black Lives Matter. The foreword is by Angela Davis. And the foreword is all about sex, culture, sex, culture, sex, culture, gender, gender, gender. She uses the word comrades 4 or 5 times in like 3 pages. So if you go to the website of People's World, which is the flagship publication of the American Communist Party, it was the former Daily Worker. In the About section, they issue a call there for cultural workers, cultural workers. So today they're really not fighting over tax cuts and redistribution of wealth.
Let's talk a bit about you for a second, Dr. Kengor. Where are you from? What's your background? How did you get into political science? And how does your faith influence your work and scholarship in that field?
Well, that's a long story, but I graduated from college. My senior year was the year that the Berlin Wall fell. And so that was 1989, 1990. I was the editorial page editor for my student newspaper, the Pitt News, at the University of Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. I met my wife there. She was the copy editor, and I was actually pre-med, and so I worked for Dr. Thomas Starzl and the organ transplant team. He was the guy who pioneered organ transplantation. We did 90% of the world's organ transplants there in the late 1980s. In fact, they just did a beautiful documentary on him called Burden of Genius, which my wife and I saw at the Carnegie Science Center amphitheater in Pittsburgh about a year ago, and it really took me back. It was really moving for me to watch. But I was really taken in by the collapse of communism, Reagan, Gorbachev, Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul II, the Solidarity Movement in Poland, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. All these issues, became very interested in politics, ended up splitting my major my senior year. I had been biochemistry, biophysics, and microbiology. And then I added on political science, of all things. So I even asked my boss, I worked for 4 years, 30 hours a week, full time in the summers. I was working for the organ transplant team and taking classes. And I asked my boss, Sandy Stashchak, I said, yeah, that job that you've been holding for me, that full-time position, would you still give it to me if I got my degree in political science? And held off on the biochem degree for about a year, and she was very tough lady. But she looked at me and she said, "Of course, you know this up and down, you know what you're doing," and she said, "You know it, you know the work. Yes, I'll hire you." And I said, "Well, I'm going to get the biochem degree too," which I was. And she said, "Well, wait and see how it plays out." And so I spent about the next year and a half working full time, and really in a kind of tug of war. I was an agnostic at that point, if not an atheist. And I would walk to my apartment on the way home from class or from the transplant team at that point. It was Presbyterian University Hospital and Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh. And I would stop at St. Paul's Cathedral in Pittsburgh and just plead with God, if you're there, right? What do you want me to do with my life? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? Can't you tell me? Give me a sign. And so it was a really kind of an agonizing time, but I ended up getting my master's degree at American University in Washington and international affairs. And I ended up studying this issue, ended up going and getting my PhD and focusing on the Cold War, communism, the Reagan presidency, which really introduced me to John Paul II, all of this, a lot of it. I had been raised Catholic in the 70s, the Dark Ages. So I had easily left the faith. I knew absolutely nothing about the faith, absolutely nothing. And I really was kind of brought to Christ, if you will, through evangelicals.
Wow.
It became an evangelical, a Protestant, Presbyterian Church USA. And then after a kind of a long process of really, really intense study, and this is a much longer story, but I came back into the church right when John Paul II died, April 2005. And in fact, Easter Vigil, April 2005. And that brought me back to the faith.
Wow. I know
I can do
you
a whole hour just on that.
I know, I can tell. Next time we do this.
Next time.
I also read your book, A Pope and a President, which you wrote about JP2 and Reagan. And I don't want to go into any detail about that other than I was just wondering if there's anything that stood out when you were doing that book, writing that book, something that stood out about John Paul II in your mind.
We should do a show just on that. I mean, so much. I mean, Fatima, and I mean, I'll say this, that book was so hard to write because I had so much in front of me. And I think it ended up related to Bob's point on having like this just massive project with all these words. It was about a 340,000 word manuscript, I think. It ended up being about a 700-page book.
Wow.
And it could have been even longer, right? So it was really hard to kind of decide what to keep out. But I spent probably 10 years on that. That was the project I couldn't walk away from because I kept learning more new information that I knew no one else knew. People from the Reagan administration telling me before they died, right?
Wow.
Things like, let me tell you about this secret report that no one's ever seen before, right? We learned that the Soviets did it. The Soviets ordered the hit on the Pope. The Soviets tried to kill John Paul II. In fact, I'll tell you this, the person that I quote in that book, Chris, who says things like, it was the most secretive report that I've ever seen. We had to remove the eyeballs from the corpses of the people who read the report after we shot them, right? He was joking. We had to shoot the secretary after she typed the report, right? He was joking. That person was Herb Meyer. And Herb died quite tragically and quite unexpectedly about 2 years ago. And so I can now divulge that Herb was the source. At the time of the book, I couldn't say that.
Wow.
He was Bill Casey's right-hand man at the CIA. And it was really Bill Casey and Bill Clark, two Irish Catholics, who were the two most important figures in the Reagan administration, and coming up with the plan to undermine the Soviet Union. And also, it was really the troika, if you will, to borrow from kind of Soviet speak. Bill Clark, Bill Casey, and Pio Laghi, the apostolic nuncio in Washington, who were the three conduits between the White House and the Vatican, between John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, in discussing what each side would do and could do to help facilitate the takedown of the Soviet Union.
Fascinating.
Well, I think we should schedule a writer's chat on that book. I think many people will find that fascinating. In fact, we do have a question in chat, if you don't mind me interjecting, Chris.
No,
From Teresa Bell. Teresa's in Canada, and she writes, can you make some comment between the warning of Our Lady of Fatima regarding communism?
Yeah, so she first appeared May 13th, 1917. John Paul II was shot on May 13th, 1981. And in fact, he would read the third secret of Fatima just a few weeks later, July 18th, 1981, when Cardinal Sepper from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith brought him the third secret of Fatima in the original Portuguese text and an Italian translation. In fact, John Paul II said to Cardinal Givich, who wasn't a cardinal at that point, he said, 2/13 of May, 2/13 of May, May 13th, 1917, May 13th, 1981. And he asked to see the third secret, and he sat there and he read it in Portuguese, he read it in Italian, and he said, this is it. This applies to me. This applies to me. The third secret applies to me. So it was, my battery's running low. I hope my battery doesn't die. It was, yeah, Fatima predicted, the third secret predicted the apparent assassination, shooting, killing, death of the bishop that wears white. And the bishop that wears white is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, John Paul II. The first time that I read about Fatima, I was a Protestant. And in fact, I didn't even know how to pronounce it. I said like Fatima or something, right? Probably is actually how they pronounce it over there. I don't know. But I was reading it and I thought, and it's funny, I was talking to Scott Hahn about this. And Scott, like me, is a Grove City College guy. We're very close. We're really good friends. And he was talking about being with his wife, Kimberly, when she was about to give birth, right? She had a room. She hadn't been taken in yet to deliver the baby. But he said the TV was on, and I was watching the show on, I don't know if it was EWTN or whatever, and Scott wasn't even Catholic then. And he said it was about Fatima. And he said, and this is the exact same reaction I had. He said, I was fascinated. I couldn't take my eyes off it. So even though I wasn't Catholic, and normally would have shrugged off, kind of crazy Catholic stuff. But I watched this and I saw this and I saw the predictions and I heard about the witnesses, the 70,000 witnesses and the miracle of the sun and the predictions. And I thought, this has got to be true. Who could make up something like this? And so Fatima was one of the things that kind of looped me in to all of that. And to find out that Reagan knew about Fatima, I write about Reagan and Fatima and a Pope and a president. And to watch all of that play out, that's a Pope and a president. I opened the book with May 13th, 1981, John Paul II being shot in St. Peter's Square. And then I drop back to May 13th, 1917, and then kind of go chronologically up through it. So I think that's the story of the 20th century. And yet it's not over because as you know, the battle against evil continues, not just in the form of communism.
Well, thank you, Paul, for that. We have another question. I think we're going to, unless you have another question you'd like to ask, we can go to the questions from the audience. And if anyone
I hope this doesn't die.
No,
if this dies out, I'll be finished.
We'll go for a few more minutes, and as long as you are with us.
Yeah, I didn't expect it to be out of juice. I'm surprised. Anyway, go ahead.
We have a question from Francis, and Francis is asking, the Russian Orthodox Church appears to support and have the support of the Russian government today. That's the second part. I'm sorry. The first part is, what is the Russian Orthodox Church's relation to the communist theories and actions? And then he goes on to say they appear to support and have the support of the Russian government today.
Yeah, it's a very complicated thing. And Vladimir Putin is not a communist. He's a Russian nationalist, an authoritarian, a traditionalist. He says the collapse of the USSR was a catastrophe. He says that because he favors this greater Russia. He's a Christian. He's a believer. I mean, some people might say he's not a very good Christian. That's fine. I understand that. But the Russian Orthodox Church, he is. They don't support communism. They're completely against communism. But they do continue to have this rivalry with the Roman Catholic Church. And I quote in A Pope and a President, we now have this declassified, the meeting between Mikhail Gorbachev and John Paul II at the Vatican. And there's this really interesting moment where Gorbachev invites John Paul II to Moscow. And John Paul II, Slavic, Polish, spoke Russian and Polish. And he says very diplomatically to Mikhail Gorbachev, he says something like, I wish I could think of the exact words, but it's something like, if that would be acceptable, yes, I would be very pleased to do that. And the phrase, if that would be acceptable, I think that was the phrase that was used. That was applied to really whether or not it was acceptable to the Russian Orthodox Church.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason JP2 didn't go to Russia was the Russian Orthodox Church. It wasn't the communists. It wasn't the atheists. It was the Russian Orthodox Church. And, you know, they've been in a battle with Rome for a long, long, long time. And that's still going on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we have another question from Joan Clark. Are you aware of the satanic churches in Texas? And on top of that, the vampire clubs in Houston? We may have lost him on that one.
Well,
We may have. Bob?
well, maybe it's better not to talk about vampires and Satan.
Satanic churches.
But I do feel that the essential thread between the battle between Christianity and an ideology like communism has to do with the view of the person. These ideologies place the person into a mass, a class, or a race, or a sex, or a gender, and they don't look at the individual person. And the Christian faith talks about the individual soul and the dignity of the person in his choice for good or for evil and his relation to God. So as long as an ideology makes people into indistinguishable elements of a mass phenomenon, then there's a conflict between that concept of human beings and the Christian concept. And we've gotten a lot of mass movements in the last 200-300 years, and we're always subject to them, I guess. And so Christianity, it doesn't even have to be left versus right. We could be opposed to both the left and the right. We're standing in a different position altogether. We're standing in a position that speaks of the individual person as someone of enormous dignity, each one of us. That's why we love our families, our children, our parents. And when you don't have this individual dignity and you start to make a mass type of categorization, you end up losing that love. And you will run over your parents or run over your children or your neighbors in order to be loyal to the ideal, the ideology. And that's what I took from his book, Paul Kengor's book, and from the reflection on communism, Karl Marx, his passion for a kind of propertyless society, a vision of a utopian world, but it was against all the ordinary principles of human love, where I love a certain thing that I then can give to you. Anyway, that was my thought.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate everybody joining us today. It seems that his computer did die, and it has been 1 hour. We thank you for your time, and we will ask him to schedule another writer's chat in January to discuss his other book. Thank you so much, and happy Advent to everyone.
Hello, I'm Deborah Tomlinson with Urbi at Orbi Communications. Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our channel by clicking the red subscribe button, and make sure you click that bell and you'll be notified of any new uploads. Also, check out all the links below. There's some discounts for you. Thank you.